Nirvana singer Kurt Cobain died. And we dedicate the next hour to the band, their music and their influence.
Entertain us. The story of Nirvana.
There have been many rumours surrounding the death of Kurt Cobain, but for the next hour, we're a conspiracy-free zone. Instead, this is the story of Nirvana and their music, told with the help of archive clips, interviews with the people who worked with the band, and some of their fans. Kurt Donald Cobain spent his formative years growing up in the small, bleak logging town of Aberdeen in America's northwest. His parents divorced when he was 8, an event which had a profound effect on the, up till then, happy-go-lucky youngster. The years that followed the split involved a traumatic merry-go-round for Cobain as he was shunted around living with various friends and relatives. Kurt became fascinated with the idea of punk rock, even though he'd never heard any of the records. When he did eventually hear the Clash's Sandinista, he was disappointed, but that didn't damage his appetite for music. One of his neighbours was also discovering a passion for rock. Chris Anthony Novoselic had been born in Compton, California, of Croatian parentage. His family moved to Washington State when he was 14, but unsettled by his new surroundings, the youngster was sent to Croatia for a year, where he heard punk rock for the first time. On his return, both Novoselic and Cobain spent their time at Aberdeen High School, drifting in and out of bands. But it took 3 years before they finally hooked up and started playing together. Kurt and Chris formed Nirvana in its earliest manifestation back in 1987, flirting with band names that included Ted Ed Fred, Throat Oyster and even Skid Row. The band recorded their first proper demo in January 1988 at Reciprocal Recording, a small studio in Seattle. Joining them on drums was Dale Crover, on loan from another local band, the Melvins. Meanwhile, the producer was one Jack Endino. Endino later discovered he got the job because Kurt was a fan of Soundgarden's debut single, Screaming Life, which amazingly was the first track Jack had ever produced.
This band called completely out of the blue and said, hi, we want to come up to Seattle. We're from Aberdeen. We're living in Olympia right now, and we're friends with the Melvins. And we've got Dale from the Melvins playing drums with us just for this session, and we want to come up and just record some songs. I said, well, you got Dale in the band. Dale's a great guy. I love the Melvins. He's a great drummer, so if he's playing with you, you guys must be all right. So come on up, and we picked a date. It was scheduled for January 23rd, 1988, and they said they had a show that night in Tacoma, which is about 30 miles outside of Seattle, so that they would need to get in the beginning of the day and then run out and play their show. I think the band showed up around 11:30, and by 6 o'clock they were out the door. During that time, we recorded and mixed on the old 8-track machine that we had 10 songs. Blammo, just like that. I mixed them onto quarter-inch tape in about an hour and a half, and the band walked out the door with it. But I was so struck by the band that I said, would you mind leaving the 8-track tape here, the multi-track? Because I'd like to make myself a copy of it. So they said, okay, go ahead. I made myself another quick mix, virtually identical to theirs, and took a cassette of it home. And that tape was the one that I made some copies of and began giving to people. One of whom, as it turned out, was John Poneman, who was starting the Sub Pop label.
We'll pursue the Sub Pop connection later. In the meantime, here's Jack's first impressions on Kurt, Chris and Dale Crover.
They were just guys from Aberdeen. Their equipment wasn't particularly great. Dale's drums were very nice, of course. But they struck me. They were very good players, and the singing was really pretty insane. You can hear it on side 2 of Incesticide. 5 of the songs on the last half of the Incesticide record are from that original session. They didn't screw around in the studio. They just wanted to get it done. I mean, you don't record and mix 10 songs in one afternoon unless you are very, very focused. And they were very focused. Most of the music was done in one take. So that in itself impressed me enough.
But the band's dedication to their recording wasn't the only thing that made Jack sit up and take notice.
It was Kurt's singing that stood out. He was basically screaming. It was very good screaming, actually. And even Dale said to me at one moment when I was talking to him alone in the control room, he said, you know, their music isn't that great right now, but Kurt's singing is the thing that really makes it for me, is what Dale told me. And I sort of thought the same thing. I thought there was he screamed with such passion, and just something about his voice was just, it was arresting. It certainly wasn't a commercial voice at that point, but it was an interesting rock scream. You know, from someone who's heard a lot of rock screams, I can say that it was better than most. I know there was some sort of potential there. I had no idea what it was, but it stuck with me for some reason.
Kurt sent the demo to numerous indie labels, but no one seemed to share Jack Endino's enthusiasm for the band. No one, that is, except Jonathan Poneman. Poneman and partner Bruce Pavitt's Sub Pop label was still in its infancy. So much so that Kurt didn't even know they existed. Instead, it was Endino who passed on the tape, which sent Poneman reeling at the power of Cobain's voice. While Bruce Pavitt was yet to be convinced, Poneman met up with Cobain and Novoselic and offered to put a record out by them. Simple as that. There wasn't even a contract. But not everything was going this smoothly for the fledgling Nirvana. Dale Crover upped sticks and left for San Francisco, prompting a succession of temporary replacements before they finally settled on new semi-permanent member Chad Channing. Not long after Channing joined, Poneman put the band back in the studio with Endino to record tracks that would become their first single. The result was their shocking blue cover, Love Buzz, backed with one of the band's new songs, Big Cheese. 1,000 hand-numbered copies of Nirvana's debut single were eventually released in November 1988. Nirvana returned to Reciprocal with Endino on December the 24th to begin work on their debut album. Bleach was recorded during several 4- and 5-hour sessions and cost that now legendary sum of $606.17. Kurt later admitted that at the time of Bleach, he wasn't really into lyrics. He pretty much just scribbled down the words and try and keep them simple so the songs were easier to remember when he had to play them live. Here's Jack again.
I'd say, okay, are we ready to cut vocals on this song? And he'd say, wait a minute, let me finish the lyrics. And he'd be furiously scribbling and, okay, I got the lyrics. And it was that easy for him. He could come up with lyrics pretty instantly. It was fun recording these guys. The lyrics gave me a good laugh more than once. They were very good-natured about it. Some of it is quite brilliant, actually. The song School has 3 lines. In fact, a total of 15 words. That's very economical songwriting, actually. The lyrics were pretty cryptic, pretty inscrutable, and he wasn't particularly into explaining them at the time, and it's not my business to beg people what they're talking about. As long as they seemed to work on an emotional level, it was fine. So I think in later years, he obviously spent a lot more time working on his lyrics. I think In Utero definitely reflects that. You can really see that there's a lot of intent in the lyrics. But the Bleach lyrics were pretty casual. And yeah, he still had a lot of ways to go as far as singing and playing guitar at the same time in a live situation. I know that he was definitely interested in keeping the lyrics as simple as possible so that he could perform them. But again, it was the delivery that made the difference.
As Jack says, this amazing performance in the studio hadn't yet made the transition to the live stage.
I caught a number of Nirvana live shows in the old days, in 88, 89. As a matter of fact, Nirvana opened for my band Skin Yard at least 3 times that I can recall. They were pretty much at the bottom of the Seattle pecking order at the time, so they had to open shows for a lot of people, and they weren't really that good a live band yet. Kurt still was kind of mumbling into the mic and looking at his guitar and trying to remember the words and so forth. So really the singing that he was doing in the studio was not coming across on stage. They were still a pretty great live band. but nothing close to what they became later. They weren't exceptional. They were decent. They were not amazing.
Back in the studio, Kurt felt he needed to break up the intense rock-fueled collection of songs that Bleach was becoming.
I remember Kurt took me aside and said, okay, he wanted to make sure that I knew that what he was doing here. He said, okay, I'm going to do a song that's kind of different from the rest, so don't freak out about it. It's a pop tune. It's sort of a jangly little pop tune, and I'm thinking I'll probably want to write more songs like this in the future, so we just want to make sure that the record at least has a little bit of variety on it so that it's not all just pounding heavy rock. I think he was afraid that some people in Seattle wouldn't like the song because Seattle was very much of a rock town in 1988, and we did About a Girl, and it was, in fact, a nice jangly pop tune. Very nice song. Really surprised me because I sort of didn't realize that he had that sort of thing in him, and it was really a hint, just a harbinger, if you will, of what was to come a few years later. I just remember thinking, something about this guy's ear for melody is just different from other people. There was definitely something unique going on there. Not amazingly unique, but just, there was something.
The band weren't altogether happy with Chad's drumming, and 3 tracks on the CD version of Bleach were remixed from the original demo session with Dale Crover. With these tracks, the album was complete. Here's Jack.
I was really excited about the Bleach record when we were done with it. I felt like, well, okay, maybe it's an 8-track record. Maybe the studio doesn't have much equipment. I mean, the budget was minuscule. The band really did only have $600 to spend, so we couldn't waste a whole lot of time. And it was 8-track. Considering all that, I'm still pretty happy with the Bleach record today. I do remember thinking, man, what a great record this is. It's too bad it's indie rock and probably nobody will ever hear it. A few thousand people will buy it like they buy all the other indie rock records that come out of Seattle. And, well, there'll be some fans, but probably in the big picture, nobody's ever going to care how brilliant this band is. Well, boy, was I wrong.
Jack was wrong, but back in 1989, it was a different story. Enter the next recruit to the band, Jason Everman. Jason had money and paid for the Bleach recording session. When Nirvana wanted to go out on tour, he joined them as second guitarist and received a credit on Bleach as a goodwill gesture, though he never actually played on the record. Bleach was eventually released in June 1989, around the time that the Seattle scene was really beginning to take off. And it was only then that Nirvana signed a contract with Sub Pop. Journalist Keith Cameron worked at Sounds in 1989, and he was well aware of the buzz going around about Nirvana, but he wasn't prepared for the initial impact that Bleach would have on him.
I was blown away, really, because up until that point, you thought you knew what to expect with the bands on Sub Pop. They were basically punk rockers playing heavy metal. That's a horribly crude way of putting it. There's an element of truth in there. They were punks playing metal. And which you could also say about Nirvana as well, but there was a far more sinister heart to it that those other groups didn't seem to have. The other bands seemed a bit more happy-go-lucky, and it was, it's just a bit of a laugh, really. But with Nirvana, you felt, when listening to this record, quite palpably that their lives depended on making this music. To me, it was far more emotional, and of the early Sub Pop bands, Nirvana were the ones that intrigued me most.
With hindsight, Kurt viewed the record as just one aspect of what the band were capable of.
Bleach seemed to be really one-dimensional. It just has the same format. All the songs are slow and grungy, and they're tuned down to really low notes. And I screamed a lot. But at the same time that we were recording Bleach, we had a lot more songs like About a Girl. In fact, Polly was written at that same time, too. It's just that we chose to put the more abrasive songs on the Bleach album.
Following the release of Bleach, Nirvana set out on a 26-date tour of the States, playing venues at the bottom of the indie circuit. Whilst on tour, college radio began playing tracks from the album, and word of mouth was spreading about the band and their live show. But all was not well with the group. Kurt and Chris were unhappy with Jason, partly because his playing was bringing too much of a rock element to the band. Towards the end of the tour, Jason and Nirvana went their separate ways, and the remaining dates were cancelled. In late summer '89, the band then returned to the studio. this time to Seattle's slightly more upmarket Music Source, where they recorded tracks for the Blue EP with producer Steve Fisk. Towards the end of '89, Nirvana set out on a European tour supporting heavyweight grunge godfathers Tad. The band shared the same van, playing an exhausting 36 shows in 42 days. After a particularly traumatic gig in Rome, Kurt even threatened to quit the group, but this was just a temporary glitch. The tour wound up as the Lame Fest at London's Astoria on December the 3rd, where the lineup was boosted by the appearance of Mudhoney. Nirvana didn't rate the show, but Keith Cameron did.
Nirvana were first on. I think the bands basically tossed a coin to see who went on first or something, and Nirvana lost. So they had to go on ridiculously early. The hall was, there was not many people there. And they were just coming on stage as I walked in, and I sort of immediately walked down the front. And I remember it as being an astonishing show, I really do. The band were very loose. You felt there was a lot of antagonism going on between them, which if they'd been cooped up in the same van with Tad for the previous 6 weeks, there may well have been a lot of antagonism going down. It was a mental show.
After this show, Keith met Kurt for the first time. He had to ask him a series of questions for an end-of-year survey that Sounds were doing.
One of his responses I thought was quite prescient, really. I said, "What are your hopes for the 90s?" And he said, "To debase every known form of pop music." And he said, "We missed a couple this year," which is pretty much what they did.
As the new decade dawned, it was clear that there were underground punk scenes thriving again all over America, not least on their doorstep in Seattle. The musical environment at this bottom level was at its healthiest since the heady hardcore days of the early 80s. Sub Pop decided to put Nirvana back in the studio to make their second album, this time with producer Butch Vig. As homework, Vig was sent a copy of the first album, Bleach.
I must admit, I wasn't that impressed when I heard the record, except for the song About a Girl, which to me sounded like a Beatles song. I mean, it sounded like John Lennon could have written it. But I remember putting it on and listening to it with some friends and going, "That's all right, there's a pretty cool vibe here." I thought Kurt had an amazing voice. That was the one thing that really struck me as being the most original thing on that record, and the passion.
Having agreed to work with the band, Butch had to tie down some recording time. The group had a 6-day break during a tour of America's Midwest, so they booked into Smart Studios in Wisconsin.
And they showed up in a really beat-up van. It was the quote-unquote sub-pop van. And just immediately thought they were very charming. Chris, of course, was really funny and really engaging. And Kurt, when I first met him, was also very witty and very personable, but I found immediately that he would go into these mood swings where a half hour later he would be in a corner by himself and not talking to anyone, very manic depressive. And it took me a long time to kind of figure out how his personality went in all these different directions. But it was, again, there was no pressure on, they were just making a quick record for Sub Pop. And Kurt had some problems with his voice because he'd been touring every night. And there was some tension at the time between Kurt and Chad, the drummer at the time. I think that he wasn't particularly happy with everything that Chad was doing. Sometimes I remember Kurt would get behind the kit and, try to show him play more like this. And Kurt wasn't particularly a good drummer, but other than that, the sessions, I think, went pretty well.
Working on this new record, Kurt's pop tendencies started to become more apparent.
Kurt was fairly obsessed with trying to write a great hook. I mean, he would sit around even, before we'd start doing the take and start noodling on the acoustic guitar, and I would constantly go, "Whoa, what's that?" Because he would be playing some chord progression, some melody, and it always sounded amazing. And a lot of times then he would try to squash that, because he had to stay within the punk ethic. But he loved the Beatles, and I think of the contemporary bands out there, he really respected R.E.M.
By the time the sessions were finished, Nirvana were becoming more and more frustrated with the label Sub Pop. They'd arranged practically no publicity for the group. They were fed up with kids not being able to get hold of their records, and the label was in grave financial difficulties. The tension with Chad also reached a climax, and Dale Crover returned to the drummer's seat for a short US tour. But amidst all these ups and downs, Nirvana still managed to record one of their best songs to date. During a break from working with Tad, Jack Endino re-emerged as producer, and with Mudhoney's Dan Peters on drums, the band recorded future single Sliver in just 1 hour in July 1990.
After dinner I had ice cream, I fell asleep and while
Peters played one gig with Nirvana, the infamous Motorsports show in Seattle. Journalist Keith Cameron, who was over in the States to interview the band for Sounds, saw the gig.
The show itself was amazing because I think it was the largest show they'd ever played in Seattle up to that point, and it was a weird venue because it was a garage. It was like sort of low-ceilinged corrugated iron hangar, really. It was an all ages show, which meant that there was no alcohol on sale at the venue. But there was a fairly psychotic atmosphere in the place, and someone told me afterwards that the reason for this was that all the kids, because they couldn't buy alcohol at the gig, they were either getting incredibly drunk in the sort of car park behind the garage, and also somebody said there was a particularly strong strain of LSD going around in Seattle at that point, and about half the people at the gig seemed to have taken it. So there was about 4 support bands. By the time Nirvana came on, the crowd were wound up. The place was just going to blow. You could feel it. And, you know, they just played astoundingly. There was so many stage divers just, like, tumbling onto the stage. But at one point, Kurt nearly got dragged into the crowd himself because some kid sort of jumped up on stage and he had a big stringy jumper on. And the wool of his jumper got caught on one of Kurt's guitar strings, and sort of Kurt himself nearly got thrown into the crowd. And the whole gig ended with them trashing their gear. Now, Nirvana trashed their gear quite a lot, but whenever I saw them do it, you know, for the first maybe half dozen times that I saw them do it, certainly it did not feel like a cliched thing to do. It honestly seemed like it was the only way they could find any sort of proper resolution to all the energy that had been pent up and released over the previous 45 minutes or an hour or so. It was as if that was the only way they could bring the show to a fitting conclusion. But they went at it with such ferocity and with complete disregard for their own personal safety. I once saw Kurt throw his guitar at Chris, and Chris swung his bass at it like a baseball bat, and it just disintegrated. I mean, you were standing there thinking, people could get hurt there. People could get hurt. But no, that was an astounding show, really. And it was at that point that it became obvious, to me at least, that if they got it together and made the record they were capable of, you know, yeah, they could be as big as Sonic Youth.
Another spectator at the Motorsports show was a young drummer by the name of Dave Grohl. David Eric Grohl was brought up in Virginia by his mum following his parents' divorce. But it was a visit to his cousin in Illinois in 1982 which had the most profound effect on young Dave's musical taste. Cousin Tracy, hip to the underground scene, took Dave and his sister to countless punk rock shows. Grohl responded by playing in a number of bands, switching from guitar to drums, and ending up in an uncompromising hardcore group called Scream. Dave became friends with the Melvins, and it was on their recommendation that Chris and Kurt saw Dave play with Scream in San Francisco. The pair were knocked out by what they saw. Buzz Osborne from the Melvins continued the matchmaking by encouraging Dave to call Nirvana. When he did, they arranged an audition for just days after the Motorsports show, and Chris and Kurt immediately knew Dave was the man for them.
He's the most well-adjusted boy I've ever met. He's totally easy to get along with. Everyone loves him. He plays drums better than any drummer I've ever heard. I mean, he blows away John Bonham. If I had the choice of, like, bringing John Bonham back to life or to choose of any drummer of any band I couldn't even think of, they wouldn't be better than Dave. He's great.
With Dave on board, Nirvana signed with Gold Mountain Management, who also looks after Sonic Youth. And with the Butch Vig tracks circulating as demos, they went after a major label deal. It was the right time to be looking for a new label, because as alternative rock grew in profile, every record company in the States was searching for the new R.E.M. or new U2. Nirvana, of course, sounded like neither, but of the latest crop of American post-punk bands, they were musically the most ambitious, and live they turned into a compelling rock band. Not surprisingly, there were plenty of takers, all offering wads of cash. But in the end, it wasn't the dollar signs that decided where Nirvana ended up. Looking for artistic control rather than big bucks, they chose Gary Gersh at Geffen Records, the man who'd signed Sonic Youth. Gersh first saw Nirvana while Chad Channing was still in the band.
I first saw them play in Olympia, Washington. Bleach had already come out. It was a very small club. It was, very rough and very exciting, and there was a serious raw talent, just waiting to burst out, and that was apparent. But you could also feel that there was something that wasn't gelling in the group, and I guess that became apparent too, because shortly thereafter, Chad was no longer in the group.
It wasn't a magical gig. It was a very rough gem of a band starting to form. You know, it was more developmental than, oh my God, this is the next amazing thing. And I think that's the way we all always talked about it. We never talked about it, whether John Silva, who was the manager, or myself, or the guys in the band, or, you know, anybody that was around in the early days never talked like, oh my God, you know, this is going to be giant, we're going to be huge, this is going to be... It was never like that. It was always, you know, we're going to set out to make the best record that we can make right at this moment in time, and there was a certain sound that we wanted to capture on Nevermind, and Kurt and Dave and Chris really had in their minds, and that's what we set out to do.
Geffen bought Nirvana out of their Sub Pop contract and offered the cash-strapped label a percentage of the profits on the next 2 Nirvana albums, a deal which almost certainly helped save the label from bankruptcy. The band officially signed with Geffen at the end of April '91. And shortly afterwards, they went to LA to record Nevermind at Sound City Studios with Butch Vig.
The day before we went out there, I got a tape in the mail that the band had recorded on a boombox, and it had some of the songs that were going to appear on the record, some of the new songs like Come As You Are, and Teen Spirit was on there. And the boombox has these built-in mics, and they distort so bad that the whole thing was unbelievably distorted. So if you listen to that, you could kind of hear a little bit of the hooks and things. And I could hear the hello, hello, how low, you know, could hear a little bit of that, and hear the riff and Come As You Are. And between the songs, they were goofing around going, how's that sound, Butch? And this is Dave. And then Dave would play like a really sloppy drum solo. And then Kurt called me that night and said, we have the best drummer in the world. You know, we finally found the best drummer in the world, I swear to God. And of course I'm going, I've heard that before. But I could tell he was really happy because he was always complaining that they wanted someone who was really solid tempo-wise, but also hit the drums really hard.
To rave reviews from the British press. For anyone who wasn't fully aware of the band up till now, things were about to change. The Manic Street Preachers were recording Generation Terrorists at the time. Here's James Dean Bradfield.
One day, you know, we were watching MTV and, you know, we saw the video for Smells Like Teen Spirit. I remember Richie picked up on it straight away. He absolutely loved it. Nick loved it. I was like, oh, it's all right, you know, because I was scared. I heard it and I saw it and I realised it was better than anything we could do at that point. So I was just scared. So I just went, it's okay. We'd all stopped listening to the Sex Pistols because no matter how you try, it's so hard to copy the Sex Pistols. It's impossible because they're one of the best bands ever. And then I saw, you know, Smells Like Teen Spirit and heard it. And I thought, they've done it. They've actually kind of got that Pistol-esque vibe about them, but perhaps it's actually a bit better. I just remember feeling absolute insane jealousy to the point that I just wouldn't even admit that the record was good. Then, you know, Richie got the album and I heard Territorial Pissings. It sent me even more insane. I was thinking that, you know, they've actually kind of copied the Pistols but outdone the Pistols, and they're better than the Pistols, and the lyrics are brilliant and everything is perfect, and they haven't actually even tried, and they didn't get over it for years.
Noel Gallagher also saw the comparison between Nirvana and the Pistols.
Nevermind. It's the only record that's ever got close to sounding like Nevermind the Bollocks. I think it was the last great American record. Because that album came out before we had a record deal as well, and his melodies that he used to write over the music was a big influence on me. They were really pop. People think of it like it's a rock album, but man, it's the biggest commercial pop album of the last 20 years. That. But the songs are brilliant. I think he was a genius. I think he would have been the John Lennon of our generation.
Nevermind turned a whole new generation of fans onto a type of music that, with the Manchester scene and the emergence of house music, hadn't been commercially cool for years. Here's Liam Howlett from The Prodigy.
I wasn't into rock one bit, you know. I heard Smells Like Teen Spirit and I thought, yeah, this has really got some balls, you know. All of a sudden this record came out and smacked you in the face. And then I had to buy the album and just was blown away every track, you know. It definitely overrode any memories of kind of sixth formers with sort of leather jackets and greasy hair and Iron Maiden that I'd thought about before, you know, really. But I think Nirvana really captured the anger and the realness in their music, and you could really hear that, do you know what I mean, totally in the lyrics, and I just think it was just such a totally real record.
As for Mark Hamilton of Ash, Nirvana had a profound effect on his teenage years.
Me and Tim were both at school when we were about 14 when Nevermind came out, and
I remember the initial buzz and the hype was just huge, because it was this new band that just sort of exploded, and it was incredible actually, because, you know, kids who used to be metal kids just completely taken over by Nirvana, and a lot of it had to do with the sound. You know, it was just powerful pop songs really, and I think Kurt's voice was brilliant as well.
But Nevermind didn't just have an impact on this side of the Atlantic. Here's producer Butch Vig.
I remember calling John Silva, their manager, and saying, is there any chance of this record actually going #1? He said, not a chance, because Michael Jackson and U2 were at the top of the charts, and the next week it went #1. And I went and saw them in the Metro in Chicago, and I hadn't seen them for a couple months since we'd finished the record, and there was such a buzz in the air. It was like Beatlemania. I mean, there was a line around the block, and I went in and Kurt ran across and gave me a hug, and Dave came over and said he was tired of his drum kit, and I said, I want you to smash it up tonight. Your manager's here. He'll have to buy you a new one. And kidding, of course, and then he smashed his drum kit up. But they just totally seemed like they were having a good time. They were caught up in the buzz. It was cool. And the second they came on, people screamed the whole show, and girls were crying down front. And I remember I had goosebumps during the show, because I know this sounds ridiculous, but I felt like a proud father to a certain extent, being in there and having just seen this thing kind of go from ground zero to Nirvana.
Theories explaining the success of Nevermind have been pretty much worn thin over the last 5 years. The frustration of the post-Reagan 20-somethings, the birth of disillusioned teenage slackers, the explosion of college radio, it's all been done. Of the downsides that came with the popularity of Nevermind, one of the worst for Kurt was being cast as a spokesman for a generation.
We don't like to think of ourselves as a political band, because, you know, you tend to become too anal, and it becomes ridiculous if you shove it down people's throats. You know, we just ask people to be aware a little bit, and I think the songs kind of reflect that. The Reagan years have definitely set us back to where the average teenager feels kind of lost, and there isn't much hope. They're still at least aware of the mistakes that our parents' generation has made. And I just think that it'll take a little bit of time for kids to start doing the duties that they're supposed to do, which is challenge things.
Away from the public eye, Kurt's use of heroin was becoming more frequent by December '91. He'd first admitted to the rest of the band that he'd dabbled with the drug towards the end of the previous year. Now he was a more regular user, he rationalised his habit by saying that it helped him cope with the chronic stomach pains that constantly bugged him. In January 1992, Chris and Dave began to realise just how badly the heroin was screwing up Kurt, who'd now developed a $100 a day habit. But when Courtney Love found out she was pregnant, the pair of them detoxed, and Nirvana once again went on tour. It wasn't a good time though for Kurt. Clean from heroin, his stomach pains returned worse than ever. In February, Kurt and Courtney married in Hawaii. By now the success of Nirvana and Nevermind had become phenomenal, and everyone's attention rested on Kurt as the frontman. But this fame and adoration didn't suit Kurt, basically a shy and private person, and he turned once more to heroin as he worked on songs for In Utero. It was around this time that communication between the three members of Nirvana was starting to break down. Kurt didn't want to tour for a while, he needed a break, and he wanted to be with Courtney. And to make matters worse, the band then fell out over royalties. Despite further attempts at detox, Kurt still had a habit when the band went back out on the road to do gigs rescheduled from the previous December. For journalist Keith Cameron, who went to Spain to interview the band, his subsequent article would change his entire relationship with the group forever.
I think it was with some reluctance that the band found themselves out on the road at that point, really, because there was obviously lots of other distractions going down. Like, Courtney was pregnant. Kurt, unbeknownst to me at the time, was on methadone, trying to get off heroin. And there was all sorts of rumours already starting to fly around about sort of dark things at the heart of Nirvana, which I guess was true with hindsight. I found the whole thing pretty distressing, really, because, you know, I found myself in the position of having to do the story on the band. I didn't feel capable of drawing a veil over what people were telling me, or what I could see for myself, which was really that there wasn't any communication going on between the three members of the band, and they weren't playing particularly well either. Those were the first shows I'd really seen Nirvana in any way going through the motions. I mean, they were still good. I mean, don't get me wrong, by comparison with most bands, they were better than most bands, but with regard to what I'd seen Nirvana do in the past, it was lackluster, really. After that, my relationship with the band was irreparably damaged due to the article I wrote for the NME, but, my sort of admiration for them and love for them never diminished at all.
Back in the States, Kurt's drug habit increased to $400 a day, and he ended up in rehab where, as well as detoxing, he had yet more problems with his stomach. To make matters worse, Vanity Fair printed a controversial piece about Courtney Love, claiming she took heroin even after she knew she was pregnant. But on August 18th, 1992, Courtney Love gave birth to a healthy baby girl, Frances Bean Cobain. But the Vanity Fair article had caused much damage, and for a long time, Kurt and Courtney were dragged through the courts and had to fight for the right to keep their daughter. Stories about the royalties rift in the band, coupled with Kurt's ill health and the Vanity Fair piece, all fueled rumours that Nirvana were on the verge of splitting. On the 25th of August, the band was scheduled to headline the last night of the Reading Festival. But the rumours were rife that either they wouldn't show, or even if they did, they wouldn't play. Here's Phil Alexander, editor of Kerrang!
Around Reading 92, there was a great deal of speculation that Nirvana were about to split up, and I was in the unfortunate position of actually having to ask him this question while doing an interview. Chris Novoselic actually did the interview, and we were standing in this tent, surrounded by people, and when we started doing the interview, everybody just shut up. And Chris denied that they were splitting up, and then we went on to talk about the album they were making, which was In Utero. The way he described it was that In Utero really was going to be an absolution. That was his exact word. It will be an absolution for everything that we've done up until now. I think everyone around them and everyone that was actually there just thought, well, will they or won't they play? In a strange way, as a result of that gig, even though it was an incredibly triumphant gig, just the fact that they were there was good enough. But people, I suppose, in hindsight, tend to look at that show as something of a landmark.
Reading 92 was to be the last gig the band ever played in the UK. The year ended for Nirvana with the release of Incesticide, a collection of tracks from the original Jack Endino session, plus B-sides and Radio 1 sessions. In January 1993, a double A-sided single was released on the Touch and Go label, featuring the Jesus Lizards' Puss and Nirvana's Oh the Guilt. Then in February 93, the band went to Pachyderm Studios, 50 miles south of Minneapolis, to start recording that third studio album with producer Steve Albini. Before work started on In Utero, there had been a good deal of suspicion in the press about Albini working with Nirvana. After all, the pairing did seem a little inappropriate, given that Albini had openly criticised the band's music in the past.
My opinion of them as people was almost completely ignorant until I actually got a chance to talk to them. And talking to Kurt, I started to get what is probably a more fair picture of what their motives were and what kind of people they were, exactly what their influences are, what style of music they choose to make. That's kind of a secondary issue. If it's something that I can grasp and that I feel like I can do a good job on, that's really the only sort of aesthetic issue that really has any meaning. I think my sort of flippant dismissal of them, when all I knew about them was what I'd heard off the records, it was ignorant of them as people, and I grew to respect them as people before I'd met them, and then having met them and worked with them, I respected them a great deal.
When eventually he was confirmed to work on the record, Albini didn't actually meet the band until they began recording the album. But he had spoken with Kurt.
I talked to Kurt at length about what kind of record he wanted to make and why, and he brought up a number of the bands that I had been working on in the past, like the Jesus Lizard and the Breeders and the Pixies, and he mentioned all these records as records having sound quality that he liked and admired, and he was pointedly separating the batch of songs that they were working on from their earlier material, as though he was conscious of a difference in mood and a difference in tone that wouldn't be appropriate in their previous presentation. He wanted a more atmospheric sound and slightly more ominous tone at times. They did a gig in Rio, and while they were in Rio, they spent a little time in a studio there and recorded rough versions of several of the songs that were ultimately going to be on the album. And they sent me those demos, and they sent me
Nirvana took only 6 days to record In Utero, again for the most part putting everything down as live.
Nirvana had been rehearsing these songs pretty intently, and they're just intuitive, really good musicians who knew each other quite well, so the basic recording was almost effortless. All of the songs were recorded with a live band take, and then Kurt had a little notebook that had ideas that he wanted to try. On a couple of songs, he used this broken guitar amplifier that had a really brutal sound, and he was talking about how he had to keep it away from the technicians that they toured with because he was afraid they were going to fix it and then the sound would go away.
Albini took a week to mix the album, and the band at this stage were happy with the results.
When we played it back in the studio, everybody was just giddy. I remember thinking that we had really pulled something off, like we had really made a record that was sort of as they had imagined it in the beginning. It had a very big, ominous sound, but it wasn't uncultured, you know. It wasn't entirely ugly, but it had an ugliness built into it that I thought suited the songs really well. Everybody was ecstatic when we were listening to it on playback.
But when Geffen first heard the unmastered album, they weren't quite so at ease with the Albini sound. Here's A&R man Gary Gersh.
The record, when I first heard it, was unmixed and unfinished, and I had real questions about it based on what Kurt again told me he wanted the record to be when he went in with Albini. And Kurt's whole reason for choosing him was, I want to go in with the guy who thinks we're no good and show him what we're really all about. And I felt like In Utero could sound a lot better than it did, but I heard it unfinished.
By the end of April, the band's enthusiasm for In Utero was on the wane, and Scott Litt, known for his work with R.E.M., was brought in to remix the singles Heart-Shaped Box and All Apologies. The record was also tweaked at the mastering stage. Originally going under the title I Hate Myself and I Want to Die, and then Verse, Chorus, Verse, In Utero was a comparatively modest, low-budget follow-up to the multi-platinum Nevermind. With In Utero, Kurt did spend more time on the words, and unlike previous albums, the lyrics were contained on the inlay. The words to In Utero have been analysed beyond belief, but with lines like Teenage angst has paid off well, now I'm bored and old, and You can't fire me because I quit, it wasn't difficult to deduce Kurt's frame of mind. Not only that, but the track's radio-friendly unit shifter and the controversial but in fact old song, Rape Me, was seen as a public reaction against the success of Nevermind and the invasion of privacy that Kurt and Courtney had suffered at the hands of the media. Kerrang! Editor Phil Alexander was taken to the sterile environment of the record company's office for his first hearing of In Utero.
The thing that first struck me about it was the fact that, Serve the Servants obviously was, the caustic moment and what have you, and there were a few blasting moments on there, but the thing that really struck me about it was how much their songwriting had come on. And I think it's one of the most underrated albums. I mean, funnily enough, after Nevermind came out, everyone started saying, I always liked Nirvana, and I think Bleach was an unheralded masterpiece. When In Utero came out, everyone sort of had the knives out for them. And I actually think, in hindsight, In Utero is just as significant as Nevermind in terms of the songwriting and the quality of the record. So I think it's definitely a classic album.
Journalist Keith Cameron.
That was like such a black hole of a record and such a painful record to listen to, but also such a exciting, thrilling record to listen to. Some of my favourite Nirvana songs, favourite Nirvana performances are on In Utero. I think there's things on there that they never achieved anywhere else. The quality there, the sort of horrible sense of truth about it all,
A&R man Gary Gersh.
It was a transitional moment for Kurt, going from Nevermind to what he wanted to do next to where he really wanted to go and where he was headed as a songwriter and as a record maker. There were songs that he would lovingly refer to as, I'm not going to put any of the R.E.M. songs on the next record. I'm going to save them for that great, quiet record we're going to make in the future.
Towards the end of September, In Utero was released almost 2 years to the day that Nevermind had come out. It was greeted favourably in the press and entered the charts at number 1 on both sides of the Atlantic. Nirvana embarked on a US tour with Pat Smear on board as second guitarist. Kurt was accompanied for most of the tour by Francis Bean, and he remarked to Rolling Stone magazine that, "I've never been happier in my life." In November 1993, Nirvana recorded their stunning Unplugged performance for MTV, a set that was to be released as a record 1 year later. This acoustic, sensitive treatment of Nirvana's songs brought out a quality in their music that many hadn't seen before. Here's Blur's Damon Albarn.
When I watched the Unplugged program and then got the album, I heard something which I hadn't been able to hear beforehand. I mean, it's overwhelming beauty in his voice and really lovely, simple songs when you kind of strip them down. You can't ask for much more, really, than that. I'd be happy for the rest of my life if I could sing, with that much beauty.
What else should I be? All apologies. What else should I say? Everyone is gay.
At the beginning of '94, Nirvana were confirmed as headliners for that summer's Lollapalooza tour, and they announced European dates. It was to be the band's first appearance in the UK since their August '92 Reading show. The gigs sold out immediately. Their final European tour began on February the 5th in Lisbon. They completed 15 dates of their 38-date tour, but Kurt was having throat problems and was told to rest. Then on March 4th, Kurt fell into a 20-hour coma in Rome after mixing champagne and Rohypnol. The Cobains returned to Seattle, dates were rescheduled, and a statement issued reporting that Kurt was, quote, restored to full health. Those dates never happened. On April 8th, 1994, at 8:40 a.m, Kurt's body was discovered in the greenhouse above his garage in Seattle by a visiting electrician, Gary Smith. He had been dead since Tuesday, the 5th of April. In the short term, Kurt's death marked the end of an era. Without his presence and Nirvana's music, the American rock invasion became lost and leaderless. It's also worth noting that just 3 days before he died, Oasis were interviewed for their first ever NME cover story, signalling the start of another chapter in British pop history. So Nirvana were gone, but their influence is still everywhere. Effectively, they ripped up the old rock rule book and rewrote it for the 90s. They made rock exciting and challenging again, setting the scene for the rest of the decade and infusing guitar music with new energy and ideas. They were fresh, touching and powerful, and unlike most of their peers, they managed to retain their edge and infiltrate the mainstream charts at the same time. But above all, rock and roll music at its most inspirational is about really believing in something, and Nirvana were a band that you could put heart and soul into. Here's Keith Cameron.
I think what set Nirvana apart for me was the sense that they meant it. You could listen to those songs and you knew the guy wasn't lying. You knew he wasn't making it up, which made it obviously quite scary, but it also made it really exciting as well. They amplified discontent like no other band ever has, I don't believe, really. Allying that emotional capability with also the ability to write amazing pop songs. And I don't really think anyone else has truly measured up to what they've done, certainly not this decade. There were other bands that preceded them in terms of the technique and the basic precepts for what Nirvana did were laid down earlier by bands like Husker Du and the Pixies. But Nirvana had the pop gift as well. He had a gift for melody that was as profound as I think the Beatles had, to be honest.
Rock stalwart Ozzy Osbourne.
Nirvana were such a powerful influence for the time, but they were not long enough, They were great. I thought they were really phenomenal. I thought about what we were about, and also I heard a lot of Beatles with them. I heard a lot of Lennon with them as well, with his vocal approach. Every now and again there comes a unique sound and a unique vibe, It's just all down to a vibe, and the book I'm reading about them, they were definite in what they were doing. They could have sold it for money. They didn't want to go for money. They wanted to go for the artistic freedom, which in the big picture, to have control of your music is very important, I think.
Here's Nirvana's A&R man, Gary Gersh.
The reason I think Nirvana was really so special is, for those of us that were around Kurt on a continual basis, you get to be touched by somebody who obviously, comes down from heaven with some special gift.
You don't know it at the time, like you don't know that Nevermind is going to sell 30 million records. You just think you're doing good work. But he was that rare individual who sets out, you know, with unlimited sights and with unlimited goals, and literally takes the outer layer of his skin off and lets everybody see the pain and the emotion and the thin line that people walk between being insane and being genius and being in pain and being happy all the time. And that's a very rare quality. And usually over time, the greatest records that have ever been made in history have been made by people who are willing to bare their soul in a way that others aren't. And Kurt could never do anything that was good. He could play a lot of bad shows, but you could tell that he didn't have his heart in it. But if he had his heart in something, which he did when he made his music most of the time, it was special and genius beyond belief. For me personally, Nirvana and the whole thing surrounding Nirvana and the guys and Kurt were so special, because here was a guy who was brutally vicious and as genteel as a butterfly at the same moment. And when that came through in the music at a moment when no one else could conceive of doing something like what they decided to do, there was no other place for them to go but to lead the pack.
People will no doubt continue to exploit and speculate about the tragic life and death of Kurt Cobain, but one thing you can never take away from Nirvana or their fans, the reason we love the band, the music. We'll leave the final say to Nirvana themselves and their reaction to the remarkable success of Nevermind.
I'll never get over the shock, and that's kind of good.
It was sort of a really, organic thing. There wasn't any massive hype.
I mean, there was definitely no big $1 million investment in promotion behind this record at all. It's totally organic, and it just happened.
You know, whatever's happened was surely out of our control, and I'm glad it happened. You know, it's nice to sell that many records. It's nice to turn on people to something different. People telling me, I think you guys are going to go platinum. We're like, oh man, come on. You know, if we get a gold record out of this, that'll be amazing.
It's not my fault. I've never wanted the fame involved. That's a totally different story.
Kurt Cobain, rest in peace.